December Holidays and Celebrations, Chapter 5, Name Change. Annabelle couldn't stop thinking about her ideas for the holiday bash. She even thought of a new name for the event. Annabelle wasn't crazy about the word bash and was going to suggest another title for the event at the next meeting. When the committee members gathered again, Mrs. Kessler appeared to have a slight smile on her face. Annabelle couldn't tell if it was a real smile or a fake one, but she welcomed it just as well. Annabelle really wanted to convince Mrs. Kessler to be more open and positive about things concerning the holiday celebration. As Mrs. Jacobson hurried into the room last, the meeting finally began. First, Mrs. Stewart recapped everything that was talked about at the last meeting. Okay, we have the basic outline of the event, she said. Now I think we should break down the stations and assign 2 people to work on each one, said Mrs. Stewart. Annabelle couldn't wait any longer to share her idea to rename the event, so she raised her hand and spoke up. Before we make assignments, I just wanted to ask if it might be possible to change the overall name of this event, Annabelle asked, sounding confident. What name did you have in mind, Annabelle? Mrs. Jacobson asked. I was thinking that we could call it the Super Holiday Spectacular, Annabelle said. Both Mrs. Jacobson and Mrs. Stewart nodded their head in approval. Of course, Mrs. Kessler shook her head in disapproval. I personally like the title just the way it is. I see no reason in changing things around. Besides, the banner reads Holiday Bash already, Mrs. Kessler said. Annabelle's heart sank as she listened to Mrs. Kessler's words. She couldn't believe her idea was being shot down so quickly. Mrs. Jacobson quickly spoke up, taking her side. I think it's a great new name with substance and pizzazz, she declared. I personally love it. And I love the title as well, Annabelle, Mrs. Stewart added. I think a name change is just what we need to spice up this event a bit. Caitlin, Barry, and Adele were all in favor of the name change as well. You know, it will definitely be an added expense to print up yet another banner for this event. I really think we should try to keep our expenses down, Mrs. Kessler cautioned. I think we should put it to a vote. Everyone in favor of a new title for this event, raise your right hand, Mrs. Jacobson said. Everyone in the room raised their hand except Mrs. Kessler. I guess we'll continue making arrangements for our super holiday spectacular, Mrs. Jacobson said with a grin. And I just want you to know, Miss Kessler, that I definitely understand about the added cost for the new banner. So I will personally pay for the banner myself. No worries. That announcement made Mrs. Kessler feel a little better, but not much. She still hadn't put a real smile on her face yet. The announcement also made Annabel feel much better as well. Just knowing that everyone else loved her idea about the name change really made up for the low feeling she had earlier for Mrs. Kessler's negative response. Since Mrs. Jacobson celebrated Hanukkah every year, she volunteered to pair up with Caitlin to work on the Hanukkah station. She was already starting to envision all the materials she would bring from her house to represent Hanukkah. Mrs. Stewart and Barry volunteered to work on the Christmas station. Barry thought that would be an easy station since he loved everything about Christmas. Adele and Annabelle were going to work on the Kwanzaa station. Since they were both studying about Kwanzaa and social studies, they thought it would be a perfect time to start thinking of some cool activities to do. Mrs. Kessler really didn't volunteer for any station, but she said she would oversee Annabelle and Adele since they didn't have an adult in their group. Annabelle really couldn't imagine what the assistance from Mrs. Kessler was going to look like yet, but she was still set on convincing Mrs. Kessler to have a positive outlook on it. And if anyone could do that, it would certainly be Annabelle. She was hoping her charm, amazingly witty personality, and decision to never give up could win Mrs. Kessler over. And so it was. The assignments were made. What would happen next? The committee could only imagine. Chapter 5 is finished. I have a question for you. What was Mrs. Kessler's concern about the name change, and how did Mrs. Jacobson ease her worries? Discuss this with your friends.